Aspasia Manos holds a singular, lonely record in history. She was the only woman without a drop of royal blood to ever marry a ruling king of Greece. Picture this: a beautiful Athenian girl, daughter of a colonel, capturing the heart of a young king. It sounds like the opening scene of a Disney movie, doesn't it? The perfect Cinderella illusion. But stop right there. This was no fairy tale. This was the tragic truth behind Princess Aspasia's marriage. In the frozen, gilded world of early 20th century European royalty, love was a dirty word. Marriage was not the union of two souls. It was the merger of two political corporations. When Aspasia Manos dared to love King Alexander, she didn't just breach social etiquette, she committed biological treason. She was considered a pollutant to the blue blood of the dynasty. And the price she paid? A marriage in the shadows, a sudden, bizarre death, and a life spent being erased from history. Welcome to the most magnificent tragedy of modern Greece. But in Athens at that time, their love was no longer a private matter. It touched upon the most dangerous thing: politics. Athens in 1917 was not a city of ancient wisdom. It was a city of hatred. This was the era of the national schism. Greece was ripped in two. On one side, you had the royalists, loyal to King Constantine I, who favored neutrality and secretly Germany in World War I. On the other side, you had the liberals, led by the charismatic and ruthless Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, who wanted to join the Allies, Britain and France. In June 1917, the Allies aimed their guns at Athens. They forced King Constantine I to abdicate, but they didn't abolish the monarchy. They needed a puppet. They needed a signature. So the king and his eldest son, George, were exiled to Switzerland. Who was left behind? The second son, Alexander. Alexander was 23 years old. He was never meant to be king. He was the spare. He loved fast cars, mechanics, and his German shepherd dogs. He had no training in statecraft. Suddenly, he was thrust onto the throne in a palace that felt like a funeral home. His father, mother, and brothers were kicked out of the country. He was left alone in the vast, echoing Tatoi palace, surrounded not by loyal servants, but by Venizelos spies. Alexander's fatal flaw was only one: loneliness. And when people are lonely long enough, they cling to love like a lifeline. He was a prisoner king. He had the crown, but he had no power. He had a palace, but he had no home. He was a man drowning in isolation, desperate for a hand to hold. And into this dark emotional vacuum stepped Aspasia Manos. Aspasia was not a stranger. She was a childhood playmate of the princes. She was the daughter of Colonel Petros Manos, the master of the horse. She was one of them, but not really one of them. Visually, she was striking. Dark hair, luminous eyes, a tall, statuesque figure. In a royal court dominated by Danish and German genetics, the Greek royal house was essentially a branch of the Danish monarchy. Aspasia was the embodiment of pure Greece. But here lies the drama-filled contradiction. To the Greek people, Aspasia was a daughter of the soil. To the royal family, Greek meant common. The European royal code was rigid. It was the era of the Ebenbürtigkeit, the requirement of equal birth. A king could sleep with a commoner. He could buy her a villa. He could give her diamonds. But marry her, make her queen? Impossible. It disrupted the hierarchy. It ruined diplomatic alliances. If a king married a commoner, who would the princes of England or the czars of Russia marry? It was a closed ecosystem, and Aspasia was an invasive species. Aspasia Manos was intelligent, educated in France and Switzerland, but she possessed a fatal flaw of her own: optimism. She believed that the intensity of their connection could override centuries of protocol. She looked at Alexander and didn't see a political chess piece. She saw a broken young man. Their romance began in earnest in 1915, but transformed into a lifeline in 1917. Imagine the scene, the Tatoi Palace, surrounded by dense forests. Inside, Alexander is pacing the halls, terrified of his own prime minister, missing his exiled mother. He couldn't go out. Every move was watched, so Aspasia became his secret. They met in brief, stolen moments. She was the only person in Athens who looked at him without an agenda. To Venizelos, he was a pen. To his father, he was a placeholder. To Aspasia, he was Alex. Why didn't the government stop them? But Venizelos didn't see this through the eyes of a lover. He saw it as a trap. You would assume that Prime Minister Venizelos, a man who wanted to control the king, would forbid a marriage to a royalist colonel's daughter. But Venizelos was cunning. He saw an opportunity. Venizelos knew that the biggest threat to his power was the return of the exiled king Constantine. He needed to ensure that Alexander never reconciled with his father. What better way to sever the bond between Alexander and the exiled royals than a scandalous marriage? Venizelos knew that Queen Sophia, Alexander's mother, sister of the German Kaiser, was a snob of the highest order. She would never accept Aspasia. If Alexander married Aspasia, his family would disown him. Alexander would be isolated from his bloodline, leaving him entirely dependent on Venizelos. So, the politician played the role of the benevolent uncle. He encouraged the affair. He hinted that a marriage might be possible. Aspasia and Alexander walked right into the trap. They thought Venizelos was their ally against the rigid royal protocol. They didn't realize they were being used as a wedge to split the dynasty permanently. The psychological pressure on Alexander was immense. He wrote letters to his father in Switzerland, begging for permission to marry. The response from the Hotel National in Lucerne, where the royals lived in exile, was a wall of ice. King Constantine I forbade it. Think of the crown, he wrote. Queen Sophia was more personal. She viewed Aspasia not as a woman in love, but as a gold digger, a schemer taking advantage of her son's weakness. To Sophia, Aspasia was a thief, stealing the dignity of the House of Glucksburg. The conflict, Alexander had to choose. Option A, marry a foreign princess, perhaps Mary of England, secure the throne, please his parents, remain miserable and alone in his golden cage. Option B, marry Aspasia, cause a scandal, be disowned by his parents, risk the throne, but feel loved. Alexander, driven by his hamartia of loneliness, chose option B. By 1919, the situation had reached a boiling point. The war was over, but the internal war for Alexander's soul was just beginning. Aspasia tried to break it off. She saw the toll it was taking on him. There were rumors she tried to leave Athens to spare him the choice, but Alexander threatened suicide. This is not a figure of speech. Reports suggest he was so unstable, so desperate, that the thought of losing his only emotional anchor pushed him to the edge. If you leave, I have no reason to be king and no reason to be alive, was the sentiment. This placed a terrible burden on Aspasia. She wasn't just a girlfriend anymore. She was the keeper of the king's sanity. If she left, the king might collapse and the country might fall into chaos. She stayed, but they couldn't marry publicly. The government, despite Venizelos' private games, couldn't officially sanction a marriage that violated the Constitution and the Church's laws regarding royal unions without a massive uproar. The Church of Greece was conservative. The Metropolitan would never bless it without the head of the family's, Constantine's, permission. So they chose the path of the royal outcast. They decided to marry in secret. This decision marks the transformation of Aspasia Manos. Before this, she was a debutante, a socialite. By agreeing to a secret marriage, she accepted a life in the shadows. She accepted that she would be a wife in the bedroom, but a stranger in the ballroom. She accepted that her children might be bastards in the eyes of the law. Why? Was it ambition? Perhaps. Who wouldn't want to be queen? But looking at the risks, the hatred of the royal family, the instability of the throne, the potential for assassination, it looks more like a sacrifice. She sacrificed her reputation for his stability. Imagine the nights in Athens in late 1919. The city is quiet, but the political undercurrents are humming. Aspasia sits in her room looking at the mirror. She is beautiful, young, full of life. But she knows that tomorrow she effectively ceases to exist as a private citizen and becomes a state secret. She is entering a marriage that cannot be celebrated. There will be no carriage ride through the streets, no waving from the balcony, just a terrifying silence. The stage is set. The actors are in place. The puppet king and the commoner muse are about to defy centuries of tradition. They think they can outsmart the system. They think that once the ring is on the finger, the world will have to accept them. They were tragically mistaken. The system does not forgive, and the system was already sharpening its knives. November 4th, 1919, a cold, windy night in Athens. In a normal world, the wedding of a king is a global event. It is a day of national holidays, ringing bells, street parades, and feasts that last for a week. It is the moment an empire secures its future. But tonight, the king of Greece is getting married like a fugitive on the run. There are no carriages. There are no crowds. There is no choir. Instead, there is a nervous priest sweating in a dimly lit living room, terrified that he is about to commit a crime against the state. There is a bride wearing a simple dress, looking over her shoulder as if expecting the police to burst in. And there is a groom, King Alexander, who is not trading a crown for a ring, but risking one for the other. This was the phantom wedding. It was the moment Aspasia Manos crossed the invisible line from secret lover to forbidden wife. She thought this ceremony would end her insecurity. She was wrong. It was merely the beginning of her erasure. That night they married like fugitive criminals, and from this point on, Aspasia began to be erased from history. Because on paper this is not just a scandal, it's a constitutional violation. This wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a breach of the Constitution. Under Greek law and the statutes of the royal house, the king required the permission of the head of the church and the government to marry. Alexander had neither. The location was the house of Christos Zalakostas, a close friend and a safe harbor for the couple. It was chosen for its discretion. The blinds were drawn. The servants were likely dismissed or sworn to silence. The atmosphere was suffocating. The key figure in this drama, aside from the couple, was Archimandrite Zacharistus. Imagine the position of this poor priest. He was summoned by the king. He couldn't say no to God's anointed ruler on earth, but he knew that by performing this ceremony, he was defying the metropolitan of Athens, the prime minister, and the exiled king Constantine. He was trembling. History tells us that Alexander had to reassure him, practically ordering him to proceed. "I take full responsibility," the king likely said. But in a monarchy teetering on the edge of collapse, a responsibility is a fragile shield. The vows were exchanged in whispers. "I take thee, Aspasia. I take thee, Alexander." There were no golden carriages waiting outside, no 21-gun salute, just the scratching of a pen on a marriage certificate that would immediately be locked away in a safe. This moment defines the drama-filled contradiction of Aspasia's life. In the eyes of God, she was now the queen of the Hellenes. In the eyes of the law, she was nothing. The ceremony was brief. It lacked the pomp of the Byzantine rituals, usually afforded to royals. There were no crowns held over their heads by glorious kumbaros, best men. It was functional. It was a legal maneuver disguised as a sacrament. And when it was over, they didn't go on a honeymoon. They couldn't. Alexander had to return to the Tatoi palace alone. Aspasia had to return to her parents' home alone. They were married, but they were more separated than ever. They had just committed the perfect crime, but the loot they stole was a life they couldn't spend. In Europe, there's a type of morganatic marriage. The marriage takes place, but the wife has no official status and the children don't inherit the throne. And that's precisely the trap that's being set for Aspasia. This is a Germanic concept that had infected European royalty for centuries. It dictates that if a royal marries a person of unequal rank, a non-royal, the marriage is valid, but the wife does not take the husband's titles and the children do not inherit the throne. It is a left-handed marriage. The groom gives the bride his left hand during the ceremony instead of his right. It symbolizes, "You are my wife, but you are not my equal." However, in Greece, the concept of a morganatic marriage didn't legally exist in the same way it did in Germany. The Greek constitution didn't explicitly account for it. This made the situation even more dangerous. Was Aspasia the queen? Or was she just Madame Manos? Nobody knew. And because nobody knew, everybody panicked. For Aspasia, the morning of November 5th, 1919, must have been a psychological abyss. She woke up as the wife of the king, but she couldn't tell a soul. She couldn't wear a wedding ring in public. She couldn't be addressed as Your Majesty. She couldn't move into the palace. She was living a double life. By day, she was the daughter of Colonel Manos, attending social functions, nodding politely to officers, pretending she was still single. By night, or during secret rendezvous, she was the wife of the monarch. Think about the strain of that charade. Every time she saw Alexander in public, at a military parade, at the theater, she had to bow to him like a commoner. She had to watch him from the crowd, surrounded by generals and ministers, unable to touch him, unable to claim him. He belonged to the nation. He belonged to history. But he didn't belong to her, not when the lights were on. This is where the royal outcast theme truly begins. She wasn't cast out because she was hated yet. She was cast out because she was a secret. She was a phantom queen. She existed in the negative spaces of the king's life. In Athens, secrets have a shelf life of about 24 hours. The news of the wedding leaked. It didn't appear in the newspapers immediately, but the whispers started in the coffee houses of Syntagma Square. The king has done it. He married the colonel's daughter. The Metropolitan of Athens found out. Prime Minister Venizelos found out. Here is where the political cynicism reaches its peak. You would expect Venizelos to be furious. He was the master of Greece. The king had defied the constitution. This was grounds for abdication. But Venizelos, the old fox of Greek politics, calculated the odds. If he annulled the marriage, Alexander might resign. If Alexander resigned, the throne would be empty, and the cry for the return of King Constantine, Venizelos' archenemy, would grow louder. So Venizelos made a devil's bargain. He accepted the marriage, but on one brutal condition: it must remain a secret. Aspasia and her mother, Madame Manos, were summoned. The deal was laid out. You are married, the politicians essentially said, but you will never be queen. You will never live in the palace. You will never appear with the king on official duties. To the world, you are nothing. To the king, you are whatever he wants you to be in private. Aspasia accepted. Why? Because she had no leverage. Her fatal weakness, love, had backed her into a corner. She accepted humiliation to keep her husband on the throne. This is the tragedy of the Plan B woman. She wasn't the political alliance Alexander needed. She wasn't the foreign princess who brought land or battleships. She brought only herself. And the state decided that herself was worth zero political capital. So the charade continued. But now it was state-sanctioned. Aspasia became a non-person. She was erased from the official narrative. In the court circulars, Alexander was listed as a bachelor. Imagine the pain of reading the newspaper and seeing your husband described as Europe's most eligible bachelor, while you are sitting in his child's nursery, metaphorically speaking. It is a form of gaslighting on a national scale. If the situation in Athens was a cold political calculation, the situation in Switzerland was a volcano of aristocratic rage. News reached the exiled King Constantine and Queen Sophia. We must focus on Queen Sophia. She was the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. She was a Hohenzollern. She believed in the divine right of kings. To her, blood was not just biology, it was theology. When she heard Alexander had married that Greek woman, she didn't see it as a romance. She saw it as pollution. Sophia wrote furious letters. She refused to acknowledge Aspasia's name. In her correspondence, she referred to the marriage as invalid, illegal, and disgusting. To Sophia, Alexander had betrayed the trade union of kings. He had lowered the value of the brand. This rejection from the family hurt Alexander more than the political maneuvering of Venizelos. He was a mama's boy at heart. He craved approval. He tried to write to them, explaining Aspasia's virtues. She is Greek. She understands our people, he argued. She is a commoner, was the only reply that mattered. Aspasia, sitting in Athens, felt this hatred from across the Alps. She knew that the people who should be her in-laws, the grandparents of her future children, viewed her as a parasite. She wasn't just an outcast in the palace, she was an outcast in the family tree. She realized that if the exiled king ever returned, her life would be over. She was banking everything on Venizelos keeping the royals out of Greece. The irony is bitter. The woman who loved a king had to pray for the continuation of the republic, or at least the Venizelist regime that held her husband prisoner, because the royal family was her greatest threat. By the summer of 1920, the stakes were raised to the heavens. Aspasia was pregnant. This should be the joyous climax of a marriage, the production of an heir, the security of the dynasty. In any other context, cannons would fire. The nation would celebrate. But for Aspasia, the pregnancy was a terrifying complication. A child meant the secret couldn't be kept forever. A pregnant belly is a ticking clock. It forced the question, what is this child? Is it a prince, a princess, or is it a bastard? If the marriage is secret and morganatic, the child has no rights to the throne. But Alexander was the last king left in Athens. If he died, who would succeed him? His child or his exiled brothers? The pregnancy turned Aspasia from a passive secret into an active threat. To the royalists in exile, this unborn child was a usurper, a half-blood pretender that could block the restoration of the true line. To Venizelos, the child was a problem. It complicated the succession laws. Aspasia felt the walls closing in. She moved to Paris for a while, supposedly for health reasons, but really to hide the growing bump. Even her maternity was a covert operation. She was carrying the future of the Greek monarchy, but she had to hide it under loose coats and vague excuses. This is the ultimate loneliness of the royal outcast. She was creating life, but she was surrounded by political death. She had no nursery being prepared in the palace. no nannies being interviewed, just fear. Fear that the child would be born into a world that didn't want it. Throughout 1920, they thought they had found a fragile balance. Alexander and Aspasia seemed to have found a fragile equilibrium. They were together. They were expecting a child. They had beaten the system by simply surviving within it. They had their secret villa. They had their stolen drives in Alexander's fast cars. They thought the worst was over. They thought they had weathered the storm of the wedding and the scandal. But fate did not agree. On the morning of October 2nd, 1920, in Tatoi, a monkey began to rewrite history. It sounds like a joke, a grotesque, absurd joke. But the tragedy of Aspasia Manos was about to shift from a political drama to a medical horror story. The phantom wedding had bound her to the king, but it hadn't given her the power to save him. And when the bite happened, Aspasia would learn the true definition of being an outcast. It means standing outside the door while the person you love is dying inside, and the guards won't let you in. Winston Churchill, a man who rarely exaggerated, once wrote about the death of King Alexander of Greece with chilling precision. It is perhaps no exaggeration to remark that 250,000 persons died of this monkey's bite. It sounds insane, doesn't it? How could a small animal in a royal garden cause the fall of a government, the return of an exiled king, and a bloody massacre in Asia Minor? But today, we are not here to discuss geopolitics. We are here to witness the personal demolition of a woman's life. To the world, October 2nd, 1920 was a bizarre historical accident, but for Aspasia Manos, it was the day her horror fairy tale truly began. It was the day fate decided that being a secret wife wasn't painful enough. She had to become the cursed widow. Let us rewind the clock to the gardens of Tatoi Palace, where a morning walk turned into a nightmare that would destroy a nation and erase a woman. Picture the setting. Tatoi Palace lies at the foot of Mount Parnitha, surrounded by dense pine forests. It was the only sanctuary Alexander and Aspasia had, the only place where the suffocating gaze of Athens couldn't reach them. On the morning of October 2nd, Alexander went for a walk with his favorite German shepherd Fritz. He was inspecting the vineyards. The vineyard manager kept a pair of Barbary macaques as pets. Here is where the script of God becomes cruel. Fritz, following a predatory instinct, attacked the female monkey. A brawl erupted. Alexander, instead of calling for the guards, jumped in to separate them. This was his fatal weakness, hamartia, impulsiveness. He always believed he could handle everything physically, from driving cars at breakneck speeds to breaking up animal fights. He managed to pull the dog away, but he didn't see the male monkey. The male, defending his mate, dropped from the trees. He didn't just bite, he attacked with frenzied violence. He bit deep into the king's leg and stomach. Servants ran to the scene. They chased the monkeys away. Alexander stood up, bleeding heavily. But he laughed. "It is nothing," he said, "just a scratch." He demanded the incident be kept a secret. He didn't want the press to know. He didn't want his subjects to think their king had been bested by a pet monkey. Silence. Once again, silence. The same silence that hid his marriage was now hiding the death creeping through his veins. The wounds were cleaned with alcohol and bandaged. Alexander returned to his bedroom. By that evening, he had a fever. The wounds began to swell. Sepsis had begun. We must remember this is 1920. Penicillin had not yet been discovered. Fleming would only find it in 1928. Antibiotics were non-existent. The only weapon medicine had against gangrenous infection was amputation. The royal doctors were summoned. They saw the king's leg turning purple. They knew what had to be done. Medical textbooks were clear. Cut off the leg to save the life. But they didn't do it. Why? This is where the political tragedy kills the patient. The doctors were terrified, not of blood, but of responsibility. Who dares to be the man to cut off the leg of the king of Greece? If they amputated and the king lived, he would be a crippled monarch. Could a one-legged king rule a country at war? The image of strength would collapse. If they amputated and the king died anyway, they would be accused of regicide. Hesitation filled the halls of Tatoi. They discussed, they argued, they applied compresses, they waited. Meanwhile, the bacteria didn't wait. It traveled from the leg to the thigh into the blood, attacking the internal organs. Where was Aspasia during this? Initially, she wasn't at Tatoi. She was in Athens. When she heard her husband was lightly injured, she was concerned but not panicked. But as the fever spiked, Aspasia rushed to Tatoi, and there she faced the first wall of true rejection. When Aspasia arrived at the palace gates, the guards and government officials hesitated. Why? Because the marriage was still an open secret. If they allowed Aspasia to enter and nurse the king, it would be a de facto recognition of her status. In those first critical hours, there were efforts to block her. The Venizelos government feared that if the king died, Aspasia's presence would complicate the succession. But Alexander's condition deteriorated too fast. In his delirium, he didn't call for his mother. He didn't call for the prime minister. He called for Aspasia. Finally, humanity or desperation overrode politics. They let her in. The scene Aspasia walked into must have haunted her for the rest of her life. The healthy, vibrant man she loved was rotting alive in his bed. The smell of gangrene hung heavy in the room. Aspasia was not a doctor. She couldn't save him. But she did the only thing she could. She became his private nurse. For 23 agonizing days, Aspasia barely slept. She wiped his brow. She changed his bandages. She held his hand when he screamed in pain. Here is the most expensive visual of the story. A pregnant woman. Aspasia was several months pregnant. Her belly just starting to show, sitting beside her dying husband, in a room full of helpless doctors and calculating politicians who were already plotting who would replace him. She was the only person in that room who loved Alexander for Alexander. The rest loved the crown he was wearing, or feared the crown falling. As death approached, Alexander had one final wish. He wanted to see his mother. Queen Sophia was in exile in Switzerland. The Greek government, the Venizelos regime, faced a dilemma. Allowing Queen Sophia to return meant allowing a political enemy to set foot on Greek soil. It could spark a royalist coup. But denying the dying wish of a king is inhumane. So, what did they do? They denied it. The Venizelos government refused to grant a visa to Queen Sophia. They feared her influence more than they pitied her son. Instead, they allowed Alexander's grandmother, the Dowager Queen Olga, living in exile in France and considered less politically dangerous, to return. But fate twisted the knife again. The sea was rough. Queen Olga's ship was delayed by storms. She couldn't make it in time. Look at the radical loneliness of Alexander in his final hours. Parents, banned from entering. Grandmother, stuck at sea. Brothers, in exile. The only person holding his hand, as the breath left his body, was Aspasia Manos, the woman his family despised, the woman his government wanted to hide. Aspasia Manos became the king's entire family. The outcast was the only one performing the familial duty. This is the bitterest irony of history. The people with the noble blue blood were absent due to politics. The woman with the common blood was present due to love. October 25th, 1920. Alexander took his last breath. He was only 27 years old. The room fell silent. But for Aspasia, that silence was the starting gun for a new war. The moment Alexander's heart stopped, Aspasia's status changed completely. 1 minute ago, she was the king's wife, protected by his supreme, albeit fragile, power. 1 minute later, she was a pregnant widow, with no title, no assets, and no allies. The Venizelos government collapsed shortly after, losing the elections, partly because the king's death caused a crisis. The royalists won. King Constantine I and Queen Sophia prepared to return. Imagine Aspasia's terror. The people who had cursed her from afar were now coming to take ownership of the palace. She was carrying their grandchild in her womb, but she knew they wouldn't bring gifts. They would bring eviction notices. Aspasia stood by her husband's corpse. She wasn't just weeping for the loss of her lover. She was weeping for her own future. She knew she was about to be thrown to the wolves. Winston Churchill was right. The monkey's bite killed 250,000 people in the subsequent Greco-Turkish War due to the regime change. But the first victim, the most immediate casualty of that bite, was the woman standing alone in the cold room at Tatoi. The monkey killed Alexander physically, but the royal family was about to kill Aspasia spiritually. Imagine attending the funeral of your husband. You are carrying his child. You nursed him through his dying breaths. You are the only person who truly knew the man inside the uniform. But when you arrive at the cathedral, there is no seat for you in the front row. The front row is reserved for the people who abandoned him. You are pushed to the side, hidden behind a pillar, treated like a shameful secret that the family hopes will just disappear. This was the reality for Aspasia Manos in November 1920. King Alexander was dead. And with his death, the brief, fragile protection he offered her evaporated. The royal purge had begun. The exiled lions were returning to reclaim their territory, and their first order of business was to wipe away the trace of the commoner who had dared to sleep in the king's bed. This is the story of how a dynasty tried to erase a woman. The funeral of King Alexander was a masterpiece of political theater. To the public, it was a tragedy. A young, handsome king cut down in his prime. To the royalists, it was an inconvenience. Alexander was a usurper king, put there by the allies. They wanted to bury him quickly so they could bring back the real king, his father Constantine. Aspasia's position during these days was excruciating. Legally, she was his wife. Politically, she was a ghost. The government, still in transition and terrified of the incoming royals, did not know what to do with her. Should she walk behind the coffin? Protocol says the queen walks behind the king, but if she walks there, they admit she is queen. So a compromise was reached, a cruel, humiliating compromise. Aspasia was allowed to attend, but not as his wife. She was treated as a private friend. The streets of Athens are lined with thousands of weeping Greeks. The gun carriage rolls by. Behind it walk the dignitaries, the generals, the foreign princes, and somewhere in that crowd, isolated, dressed in heavy black mourning that hides her pregnancy, walks Aspasia. She is grieving the loss of her soulmate. The others are grieving the loss of a political figurehead. The gap between the public performance of grief and the private reality of pain has never been wider. When the coffin was lowered into the crypt at Tatoi, Aspasia must have felt the earth closing over her own life. She wasn't just burying Alexander, she was burying her identity. Without him, she was just Miss Manos again, but a Miss Manos who was ruined, pregnant, and hated by the most powerful family in Europe. With Alexander buried, the stage was cleared for the return of the exiles. A plebiscite, referendum, was held. The Greeks, tired of war and Venizelos, voted for the return of King Constantine I. In December 1920, the royal yacht sailed into Corinth. King Constantine I and Queen Sophia stepped back onto Greek soil. Let's focus on Queen Sophia. She is the antagonist of this chapter. She was the sister of Kaiser Wilhelm II. She was a woman of iron will, deep prejudice, and immense pride. She had spent years in a hotel in Switzerland, seething with anger at how her son Alexander had betrayed the family by taking the throne and marrying a Greek commoner. When Sophia arrived at the palace, she didn't ask to see her grieving daughter-in-law. She didn't ask about the grandchild growing in Aspasia's womb. Her attitude was one of cold, absolute denial. To Sophia, the marriage did not exist. It was a teenage mistake, a dirty little affair. She refused to utter Aspasia's name. This wasn't just personal dislike, it was a political strategy. If Sophia acknowledged Aspasia, she acknowledged the marriage. If she acknowledged the marriage, she acknowledged that Alexander was a legitimate king, not a usurper. And if Alexander was a legitimate king, then his child, Aspasia's baby, would be the rightful heir to the throne, ahead of Constantine's other sons. So for the sake of the dynasty, Aspasia had to be unpersoned. Sophia commanded the court. The order was given. Aspasia Manos is not to be received. She is not to be spoken of. She is a non-entity. The inevitable happened swiftly. Aspasia was living at the Tatoi Palace, the home she had shared with Alexander. It was filled with his clothes, his dogs, his smell. The royal family wanted Tatoi back. It was their private estate. Aspasia was told to leave. There was no violence, no guards dragging her out. It was colder than that. It was an administrative dismissal. The king requires the residence. Imagine the humiliation. Aspasia, heavily pregnant with the king's child, packing her trunks. She wasn't leaving as a queen dowager moving to a dower house. She was leaving like a dismissed servant. She had to leave behind the cars Alexander loved. She had to leave behind the gardens where the fatal bite happened. She moved back to her parents' house in Athens, from the palace to the colonel's house. In a matter of weeks, she had fallen from the highest peak in Greece to the bottom of the social ladder. Society in Athens is small. Everyone knew she had been kicked out. The friends who had courted her favor when Alexander was alive now crossed the street to avoid her. They didn't want to offend the returned Queen Sophia. Aspasia Manos was radioactive. As 1920 turned into 1921, Aspasia's belly grew. This child was the single greatest threat to the restored royal family. Why? Because of the law of succession. If the child was a boy, he would be the king of Greece. Under the Greek constitution at the time, the son of the king succeeds the king. Alexander was king. His son would be king. This would bypass King Constantine, the grandfather, and Prince George, the uncle. The royal family was terrified of Aspasia's womb. They prayed for a girl. A girl cannot inherit the throne under Salic law, which the Greek monarchy followed loosely via the Danish protocol. A girl would just be a nuisance. A boy would be a constitutional crisis. This is the detective element. The royal family and their lawyers began working overtime to find loopholes. They drafted legal arguments stating that the marriage was invalid because it lacked the king's father's permission. Therefore, any child born would be illegitimate. They were preparing to bastardize their own grandchild to protect their power. Aspasia knew this. She knew she was carrying a target. She lived in fear, not for her life, but for her child's future. She realized that she had to fight. She wasn't fighting for a crown anymore. She was fighting for a name. She refused to let her child be written down in the history books as the bastard of Alexander. March 25th, 1921. Aspasia went into labor. The date is symbolic. March 25th is Greek Independence Day, a day of national pride. In a modest room in her parents' house, not in a royal palace, the child was born. It was a girl, She was named Alexandra, after her father. In the royal palace, there was likely a collective sigh of relief. It's a girl. The crisis was averted. A girl could not claim the throne. Constantine was safe. George was safe. The royal family could now afford to be slightly less cruel because the threat level had dropped from red to yellow. But they still didn't embrace her. Queen Sophia, the grandmother, did not rush to see the baby. King Constantine, the grandfather, did not send a royal decree declaring her a princess. For months, little Alexandra had no title. She was just Alexandra Manos, the daughter of a commoner. However, there was one person who broke ranks, Dowager Queen Olga. Remember her? The grandmother who got stuck at sea while Alexander was dying. Olga was a Romanov, Russian royalty. She had seen her entire family slaughtered by the Bolsheviks in 1917. She understood that life is short and family is everything. She was the only one who visited Aspasia. She was the only one who held the baby. She reportedly said she looks exactly like him. Olga became Aspasia's only ally inside the fortress. She began to whisper in Constantine's ear, "We cannot leave Alexander's child like this. It is a sin." The people loved Alexander. If we treat his widow like a dog, the people will hate us. She looks at her daughter and she makes a vow. They can erase me, but they will not erase you. You are a princess of Greece, and I will make them say it. The royal purge had succeeded in removing Aspasia from the palace, but it failed to break her spirit. Instead of disappearing, Aspasia began to lawyer up. She began to reach out to the press. She began to play the long game. She realized that in the court of public opinion, a grieving widow with a beautiful baby is more powerful than a cold foreign queen. The battle for the title was about to begin. In 1921, there was a woman walking the streets of Athens who was a living paradox. She had been the wife of the king, but she wasn't a queen. She was the mother of the king's only child, but she wasn't a royal mother. She was technically a nobody, yet she was the most discussed woman in the country. This is the phase of the nameless widow. After the eviction from the palace, Aspasia Manos entered a psychological wilderness. The royal family hoped that by stripping her of titles and money, they would strip her of dignity. They wanted her to beg. They wanted her to disappear into a scandalous obscurity. But they underestimated the resilience of a woman who has nothing left to lose. This chapter is about the brutal economics of being a royal outcast and the slow grinding war to turn a bastard into a princess. Let's look at the detective aspect of her financial situation, because money is often the truest indicator of how royalty treats its outcasts. When King Alexander died, he died intestate, without a will. Normally, his estate would go to his wife and child, but since the royal family declared the marriage invalid, Aspasia was legally a stranger to him. She was entitled to nothing. Alexander's private fortune, his cars, his cash, his personal property, was claimed by his father, King Constantine, and his heirs. Aspasia was left with a newborn baby and zero income. This wasn't just cruel. It was a siege tactic. The royal family was trying to starve her out. If she was destitute, she couldn't hire lawyers. If she was poor, she lost social standing. Aspasia had to rely on her own parents, the Manos family. They were upper middle class, but they weren't royal rich. Supporting a former queen and a royal baby was a heavy burden. The press, controlled by the royalist faction, began a smear campaign. They painted Aspasia as the gold digger who failed. They published cartoons mocking her. They whispered that she had seduced the young king just to get her hands on the crown jewels. The cruelty of this narrative is breathtaking. Here was a woman who nursed a dying man for 23 days while pregnant, being portrayed as a greedy schemer. Visualization. Imagine Aspasia in 1921. She is wearing black mourning weeds. She is walking in the parks of Athens, pushing a pram. Passers-by recognize her. Some tip their hats in silent sympathy, the Venizalists. Others turn their heads and spit on the ground, the Royalists. She is a walking political statement. Every time she appears in public with little Alexandra, she is reminding the king, "I am here, and my daughter has your son's face." In every tragedy, there is one character who retains their humanity. In this story, it was Dowager Queen Olga. We need to understand Olga deeply. She was a Romanov, a Grand Duchess of Russia, before she became Queen of Greece. In 1918, the Bolsheviks murdered her family, the Tsar, the Tsarina, and their children, in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Olga knew the smell of death. She knew that titles, crowns, and empires can vanish in a second. She knew that in the end, blood is the only thing that matters. When Olga finally arrived in Greece, delayed by the storms during Alexander's death, she was horrified by how her family was treating Aspasia. While Queen Sophia, the mother-in-law, was frozen in her German arrogance, Olga was melted by Russian sorrow. She ignored the ban. She went to Aspasia's house. This meeting changed the course of history. Olga looked at the baby, Alexandra. She saw the eyes of her dead grandson, Alexander. She embraced Aspasia. She reportedly called her, "My poor child." Olga became the bridge. She went back to the palace and confronted her son, King Constantine. "You are punishing a baby for the sins of the father," she likely argued. "This child is ours. If we reject her, we are no better than the Bolsheviks who killed my family." Olga's pressure was relentless. She was the matriarch. Constantine couldn't simply ignore his mother. Slowly the ice began to crack, not because Constantine suddenly loved Aspasia, but because he respected Olga. While this family drama was playing out in Athens, a much larger tragedy was unfolding across the Aegean Sea. The Greco-Turkish War was reaching its climax. King Constantine I had returned to the throne promising victory. He sent the Greek army deep into Turkey, towards Ankara, but it was a trap. The Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk were stronger than expected. The Greek army was overextended, undersupplied, and led by incompetent royalist officers. Why is this relevant to Aspasia? Because the war weakened the king. As the news from the front turned bad, defeats, retreats, casualties, King Constantine's popularity plummeted. He couldn't afford to be seen as a heartless monster at home while his soldiers were dying abroad. The Aspasia issue became a PR liability. The liberal press, Venezuelist, began to use Aspasia as a symbol of the king's cruelty. He sends our sons to die in Turkey, and he starves his own grandson in Athens. Politics once again intervened in private life. To save his crumbling popularity, Constantine needed to show some humanity. In July 1922, just weeks before the final collapse of the Greek army, Constantine made a concession. He allowed a decree that recognized the marriage of members of the royal family to non-royals could be valid, but without conferring the rank of queen. It was a half measure, a legal band-aid. But before it could be fully implemented, the world exploded. September 1922, the catastrophe of Smyrna. The Greek army collapsed. Smyrna burned. Hundreds of thousands of Greek refugees fled across the sea. The army revolted. King Constantine I was forced to abdicate for the second and final time. He left Greece in disgrace and died shortly after in Italy. With Constantine gone, who became king? George II, Alexander's older brother. This is a pivotal moment for Aspasia. George II was very different from his father. He had been close to Alexander before the schism. He had shared a childhood with him. He didn't carry the same visceral hatred for Aspasia that his mother Sophia did. Moreover, George II was a pragmatist. He inherited a broken country, a defeated army, and a refugee crisis. He needed to clean up the messy loose ends of the dynasty to stabilize the throne. Aspasia Manos was a loose end. In September 1922, shortly after taking the throne, King George II made a decision. He couldn't make Aspasia queen. That would still be too radical. It would offend the other European royal houses. But he couldn't leave her as Miss Manos. It was insulting to his dead brother's memory. So a legal team was assembled. They found a solution, a devil's compromise. They would recognize the marriage retroactively, but they created a specific, unique title for her. She would not be Queen Aspasia. She would be Princess Alexander of Greece and Denmark. Look at the wording. It is fascinatingly cruel and clever. She doesn't have her own name. She is defined entirely by her dead husband. She is Princess Alexander, Mrs. Alexander essentially, but with a title. It was a way of saying, you are in the family, but only because of him. You are not one of us. You are an appendage of a ghost. On September 10th, 1922, the decree was signed. Aspasia Manos ceased to be a commoner. She became a royal princess. Her daughter, Alexandra, was recognized as Princess Alexandra of Greece and Denmark. This was a massive victory. It was what Aspasia had fought for. Her daughter was no longer a bastard. She was a royal highness. She was eligible to marry kings, and eventually she would. But let's look at the philosophy of this victory. Did Aspasia win? She got the title. She got a pension, finally. She got an apartment in the palace, but she lost her freedom. By accepting the title, she placed herself under the authority of the king. She was now subject to royal protocol. She couldn't remarry without permission. She couldn't travel without permission. She couldn't raise her daughter exactly as she pleased. The child was now property of the state. Aspasia had moved from the wilderness into a gilded cage. The royal family, Queen Sophia, now the Queen Mother, still hated her. They had to bow to her in public, but they ignored her in private. At family dinners, the silence was deafening. Aspasia sat there, Princess Alexander, surrounded by people who wished she had never been born, and the tragedy of the royal outcast shifted forms. Before, she was an outcast because she was excluded. Now she was an outcast within the circle. She was the stateless person of the royal family. Too royal for the commoners, too common for the royals. The stability didn't last. The Greek monarchy in the 1920s was like a house built on quicksand. In 1924, the Second Hellenic Republic was declared. The monarchy was abolished. King George II, Aspasia, little Alexandra, and the whole family were kicked out of Greece. Aspasia Manos, the woman who fought so hard to get into the palace, was now forced out of it again, this time not by the family, but by the people. She went into exile. She traveled to Italy, then to England. She became part of the wandering tribe of deposed European royals. But in exile, something shifted. Without the pressure of the Greek throne, without the constant scrutiny of Athens, the hostility of the royal family softened slightly. Not because they loved her, but because they were all losers now. They were all outcasts together. Shared misery breeds a strange kind of solidarity. Aspasia dedicated her life to her daughter. She became the ultimate stage mom of royalty. She knew that her own life was over. She would never be queen. She would never find another love like Alexander. So she poured all her ambition into Alexandra. "You will be a queen," she likely told the little girl. "You will achieve what I was denied." This is the psychological transfer of trauma. Aspasia used her daughter to vindicate her own suffering. She educated Alexandra perfectly. She dressed her beautifully. She paraded her through the salons of Europe. She was shopping for a crown for her daughter. There's a terrifying phrase in psychology. The unlived life of the parent is the greatest burden on the child. Aspasia Manos had lived a life of almosts. She was almost queen. She was almost accepted. She was almost happy. When she went into exile in 1924, she realized her own story was effectively over. The doors of the palaces were locked to her. So she made a cold, calculated decision. She would not be the queen, but she would be the queen maker. She turned her eyes to her daughter, Alexandra. She decided that this little girl, who had her father's eyes and her mother's outcast status, would achieve everything Aspasia had been denied. Alexandra would not be a secret wife. She would be a crowned majesty. But in her desperate drive to vindicate her own suffering, Aspasia committed the ultimate tragic error. She pushed her daughter into the exact same machinery that had crushed her husband. This is the story of how a mother's ambition built a golden cage for her child. After being kicked out of Greece by the Second Republic, Aspasia didn't go to a grim apartment. She went to Venice. Using the remnants of her savings and the support of the Manos family, she acquired a small palace on the island of Giudecca. It was called the Garden of Eden, named after a previous English owner, Frederick Eden. Visualization. Picture this setting: a lush, overgrown garden surrounded by the lagoon. It looks like paradise, but it is an island within an island. Aspasia raised Alexandra here. It was a beautiful prison. Alexandra grew up hearing stories of her father, the hero King Alexander. Aspasia painted a portrait of perfection. She didn't tell her daughter about the secret wedding, the humiliation, the monkeys. She told her she was a princess of Greece, destined for greatness. Aspasia curated Alexandra's life with military precision. She sent her to the best boarding schools. She taught her how to walk, how to curtsy, how to speak to diplomats. Aspasia was creating a perfect product to sell on the royal marriage market. She knew that Alexandra's title, princess, was legally shaky, born of a retroactive decree. To secure Alexandra's future, she needed a husband whose blood was so blue it would wash away the stain of Aspasia's commoner origins. The irony? Aspasia, the woman who had married for love against all protocol, was now grooming her daughter to marry for protocol, potentially disregarding love. She had become the thing she hated. She had become a royal matchmaker. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Europe was burning again. World War II had started. The map was being redrawn. London became the waiting room for exiled monarchs. The kings of Norway, Greece, and Yugoslavia all fled the Nazis and ended up in England. Aspasia Manos saw an opportunity in the chaos. She set her sights on King Peter II of Yugoslavia. Peter was young, only 20, naive and traumatized. The Nazis had invaded his country. He was a king without a throne, living in Claridge's Hotel in London. He was perfect. He was a ruling monarch, technically. He was impressionable, and he was lonely. Aspasia maneuvered Alexandra into Peter's orbit. They met at an officers' club in London. It worked. Peter fell madly in love with the beautiful Greek princess. But history has a sick sense of humor. It repeats itself. Peter's mother, Queen Maria of Yugoslavia, hated the match. Why? Because she knew Alexandra's history. She knew Alexandra was the daughter of Aspasia Manos, the commoner. Queen Maria was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was a royal snob. She wanted her son to marry a real princess, not the daughter of a Greek colonel's daughter. Does this sound familiar? It is exactly the same script as Alexander and Queen Sophia in 1919. The mother-in-law from hell returns. But this time, Aspasia wasn't the victim. She was the strategist. She coached Alexandra. She pushed the engagement. When Queen Maria forbade the marriage, Aspasia didn't retreat. She fought. She lobbied the British government. She charmed Winston Churchill, who had a soft spot for the Greeks. Aspasia was determined. My daughter will not be a secret wife. She will be a queen. March 20th, 1944. London was being bombed by the Germans. The Blitz was over, but the V-1 rockets were falling. In the midst of this apocalypse, a royal wedding took place at the Yugoslav embassy. King Peter II married Princess Alexandra of Greece. Look at Aspasia's face in the photographs. She is standing in the background, wearing a hat, smiling. It is a smile of absolute triumph. She had done it. Her daughter was now Her Majesty, Queen Alexandra of Yugoslavia. The bastard was a queen. The commoner's child outranked half the women in Europe. Aspasia had finally beaten the ghost of Queen Sophia. She had proven that her blood was good enough for a throne. But look closer at the photo. Look at Alexandra's eyes. They are sad, haunted. And look at King Peter. He looks weak, terrified, a boy playing dress-up. Aspasia had secured the title, but she had married her daughter to a tragedy. Yugoslavia was in the grip of a brutal civil war. The communists, partisans led by Tito, were winning. The royalists, Chetniks, were losing. Aspasia had married her daughter to a king who would never set foot in his kingdom again. She bought a ticket for a sinking ship. The euphoria of the wedding lasted about as long as the champagne bubbles. Almost immediately, the reality set in. Queen Alexandra was a queen of nothing. She lived in a hotel suite in London. She had no court, no country, no subjects. Just like her mother before her, she was a royal outcast. But unlike Aspasia, Alexandra didn't have the commoner grit. Aspasia was tough. She had grown up in the real world. Alexandra had been raised in the Garden of Eden, protected from reality. She crumbled. In 1945, Alexandra gave birth to a son, Crown Prince Alexander, in a suite at Claridge's Hotel. Famous trivia: Winston Churchill declared the hotel suite Yugoslav territory for one day so the heir could be born on Yugoslav soil. But shortly after the birth, the news came. Marshal Tito abolished the monarchy. Peter II was deposed. They were destitute. They were exiles. Again, the cycle of trauma was complete. Aspasia had been the widow of a king who lost his power. Now her daughter was the wife of a king who lost his power. Alexandra fell into a deep suicidal depression. She developed anorexia. She attempted suicide multiple times. Aspasia had to rush to her daughter's side, pulling her out of bathtubs filled with blood, wresting pill bottles from her hands. This is the philosophy of the tragedy. Aspasia realized too late that the crown she chased for her daughter was made of lead, not gold. She had forced Alexandra into a destiny that destroyed her mental health. Aspasia wanted vindication for herself, but she paid for it with her daughter's sanity. By the 1950s, the dynamic shifted painfully. King Peter II, unable to cope with the loss of his throne, became an alcoholic. He cheated on Alexandra. He squandered their money on bad investments and women. Alexandra was an invalid, trapping herself in dark rooms, starving herself to death. Aspasia Manos, now in her 50s and 60s, had to become the matriarch again. She was the only functional adult in the family. She raised her grandson, Crown Prince Alexander II, because his parents were too broken to care for him. She managed the dwindling finances. She nursed her daughter through nervous breakdowns. The royal outcast was the only one holding the wreckage together. The real royals, Peter, the cousins, the dukes, were falling apart. The commoner stood tall, But it was a lonely victory. Aspasia watched her daughter suffer and knew deep down that she was the architect of this misery. If she had let Alexandra marry a banker or a doctor or a nobody, Alexandra might have been happy. But Aspasia needed a queen, and she got one, a queen of sorrows. As the years rolled on, Aspasia retreated back to the Garden of Eden in Venice. She lived alone. The garden became overgrown. The paint on the palazzo peeled. She was a relic of a bygone era. She was Princess Alexander, a title that referred to a man dead for 40 years. She spent her days writing memoirs, which were never fully published in their raw form, and looking out at the Venetian lagoon. She had won all her battles. She forced the king to marry her. She forced the government to give her a title. She forced the British to accept her daughter as a queen. But looking at the wreckage of her family, her dead husband, her suicidal daughter, her alcoholic son-in-law, she must have asked herself, was it worth it? This is the ultimate state of the royal outcast. You fight so hard to get inside the castle that you don't realize the castle is burning until you lock the door behind you. Venice is a city built on water, illusions, and decay. It is the perfect retirement home for a tragedy. In the 1950s and 60s, if you took a boat past the island of Giudecca, you might have seen an elderly woman walking in a vast overgrown garden. She stood tall, her back straight as a soldier's, dressed impeccably in black. To the tourists, she was just another wealthy widow. To the locals, she was La Principessa. But to history, she was the last survivor of a shipwreck that had happened 40 years ago. This is Aspasia Manos, in the long twilight of her life. She had outlived her husband, King Alexander. She had outlived her enemies, King Constantine and Queen Sophia. She had outlived the Greek monarchy itself, which fell, rose, and fell again. Now she was trapped in a paradise of her own making, surrounded by ghosts, watching the daughter she fought so hard to legitimize slowly crumble into madness. This chapter is about the silence that comes after the war is won, and the realization that the prize was never worth the price. Aspasia's home, the Garden of Eden, Giudecca, became a physical manifestation of her psychological state. It was a sprawling property with lush vegetation, statues, and winding paths. It was beautiful, but it was separated from the world by the lagoon. It was an island within an island. Inside the villa, Aspasia created a shrine. Photographs of King Alexander were everywhere. Alexander in uniform, Alexander with his dogs, Alexander smiling that boyish smile that had captivated her in 1915. For 50 years she remained faithful to a man who died at 27. Why? Was it undying love? Or was it because her identity was entirely constructed around him? Without Alexander, she was just a colonel's daughter who reached too high. With Alexander, she was a tragic heroine. She chose the role of the eternal widow. It was her armor. It protected her from the criticism of the world. No one attacks a woman who is perpetually mourning, but the garden was also a place of hiding. Aspasia had spent her youth fighting to be seen. She spent her old age hiding from what she had seen. She had seen the cruelty of courts, the betrayal of politicians, and the fickleness of crowds. In Venice, she could control her environment. She held court for a small circle of loyal friends, exiled royals, and intellectuals. Here, she was Your Royal Highness. Here, the phantom wedding was treated as the only truth. The greatest tragedy of Aspasia's twilight years was not her own loneliness. It was witnessing the destruction of her masterpiece, her daughter, Queen Alexandra. Aspasia had molded Alexandra to be the perfect royal. She had engineered the marriage to King Peter II of Yugoslavia. But by the 1960s, that marriage was a horror show. King Peter was dying of liver failure, cirrhosis. In the United States, penniless and delusional. Queen Alexandra was living in Venice with Aspasia, but she wasn't really there. Alexandra was battling severe mental illness, anorexia, body dysmorphia, and depression. She spent months in darkened rooms, refusing to eat, weighing less than 80 pounds. She made repeated suicide attempts. Imagine the horror for Aspasia. She was the Iron Woman. She had survived eviction, poverty, and hatred. She was made of granite. And she had to watch her daughter, who had everything, title, beauty, royal blood, shatter like glass. Aspasia became the caretaker. The queen maker became the nurse again. Just as she had nursed Alexander in 1920, she nursed Alexandra in 1960. But this time, there was no bacteria to blame. The sickness was existential. Alexandra was crushed by the weight of the crown her mother had chased for her. Every time Aspasia looked at her emaciated daughter, she saw the cost of her own ambition. The drama-filled contradiction is brutal. Aspasia wanted to give her daughter a life of privilege to protect her from suffering. Instead, the privilege became the suffering. However, in this darkness, there was one flicker of light. Crown Prince Alexander of Yugoslavia, Aspasia's grandson. Because his parents, Peter and Alexandra, were so dysfunctional, one an alcoholic, the other suicidal, the boy was effectively an orphan with living parents. Aspasia stepped in. She became the primary emotional anchor for the young prince. This is a recurring theme in royal history. The commoner, grandmother, is often the only source of normalcy for the royal grandchild. Aspasia didn't teach him how to be a king. There was no throne left. She taught him how to be a survivor. She gave him the warmth that Queen Sophia had denied her. She broke the cycle of coldness. In her grandson, Aspasia found a vindication. He grew up to be a stable, intelligent, and kind man. He was the proof that her blood, the common blood of the Manos family, was not a pollutant. It was a stabilizer. It was the Manos DNA that kept the boy sane, while the royal DNA, the Hohenzollern and Karageorgevich mix, was spiraling into madness. We must also look at the economics of her final years. Being a royal outcast is expensive. Aspasia had a title, but she didn't have a kingdom. The Greek pension was unreliable, stopped during the republics, reinstated during the Restoration, stopped again by the military junta in 1967. The Yugoslav fortune was gone, seized by Tito. Aspasia had to be a magician of finance. She quietly sold jewelry. She sold family heirlooms. She maintained the facade of royalty, the villa, the servants, the clothes, on a shoestring budget. This is a specific kind of aristocratic torture, gilded poverty. You cannot be seen working. You cannot be seen begging. You must starve in a tuxedo. Aspasia bore this with dignity. She never complained to the press. She never sold tell-all stories to the tabloids, even though they would have paid millions. She possessed a code of honor that the real royals often lacked. She understood that dignity was the only asset she had left that the government couldn't confiscate. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the world changed completely. The Beatles were on the radio. Men were walking on the moon. The concept of royalty was becoming a relic, a joke, or a celebrity soap opera. Aspasia Manos was a dinosaur. She was a woman who had married a king in secret in 1919. She belonged to a world of sepia-toned photographs. Her health began to fail. She wasn't struck down by a dramatic accident like Alexander. She faded. She spent her days in a wheelchair in the garden, looking across the water at Venice. What did she think about? Did she regret the walk in the Tatoi garden? Did she regret saying "I do" in the captain's house? We have no record of her expressing regret. Aspasia was stubborn. To regret the marriage would be to say that her life was a mistake. She held on to the love story. It was her myth. We were Romeo and Juliet, she told herself. It was a necessary lie. Because if she admitted that it was actually a tragedy of political exploitation, the pain would have been unbearable. August 7th, 1972. Aspasia Manos died in Venice. She was 75 years old. She had lived almost 3 times as long as her husband. She had spent 52 years as a widow. Her death was quiet. There was no state funeral in Athens. Greece was under a military dictatorship at the time, and the monarchy was abolished again. There were no weeping crowds, just a small circle of family and friends. But then, a final battle for legitimacy occurred, even in death. Where would she be buried? She was Princess Alexandra of Greece. Ideally, she should be buried next to her husband at the royal cemetery in Tatoi. But Tatoi was in Greece. The king, Constantine II, her husband's nephew, was in exile. The military junta controlled the land. Initially, she was buried in the cemetery of San Michele Island in Venice, an outcast in life, an outcast in death, buried in a foreign land. It took years, decades actually, for her bones to be moved. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the junta and the settling of the royal property disputes, that her remains were transferred to Tatoi. Finally, 73 years after the monkey bite, Aspasia Manos was reunited with Alexander. She was laid to rest next to him. The secret wife finally came home. The royal family, now stripped of all their power and living as common citizens themselves, could no longer stop her. Death is the great equalizer. In the cemetery of Tatoi, there are no morganatic marriages. There are only bones. She spent her twilight years watching the sun set on the Age of Kings. She saw the Russian Romanovs slaughtered. She saw the German Hohenzollerns deposed. She saw the Yugoslav Karageorgevich exiled. She saw the Greek Glucksbergs kicked out twice. And amidst all this wreckage, the colonel's daughter stood still. She was the witness. She was the one who could say, "I told you so. I told you that love was the only real thing. You chose power, and now you have neither." In the end, history is not a judge, it is a coroner. It examines the bodies left on the battlefield and determines the cause of death. We have followed Aspasia Manos through the secret weddings, the monkey bites, the royal purges, and the lonely exiles. Now we must ask the final question: who won? Did the Greek monarchy win by keeping its bloodline pure for a while? Or did Aspasia win by forcing her way into the history books, refusing to be erased? The answer is uncomfortable. Aspasia Manos was the woman who proved that you can beat the system, but the system will break your legs in the process. She is the ultimate test case for the price of forbidden love. Today we deliver the final verdict on the royal outcast who outlasted them all. Let's start at the very end. The cemetery of Tatoi. If you visit today, you will see the royal graves scattered under the pine trees. There lies King Constantine I, the man who hated her. There lies Queen Sophia, the woman who called her a whore. There lies King Alexander, the boy who died for her. And right next to him, finally, lies Aspasia. This physical placement is the ultimate visual of her victory. For 70 years, the royal family tried to keep them apart. They separated them by law, by title, and by geography. But gravity and time are on the side of the patient. In the end, the bones of the commoner and the bones of the king are mixing in the same soil. The protocols of the 1920s, the morganatic laws, the snobbery, it is all rotted away. What remains is the couple. This is the first lesson of Aspasia's life. Love is longer than politics. Regimes fall, Constitutions are rewritten, but the stubborn insistence of a woman to be buried next to her husband outlasted the kingdom of Greece itself. We defined Aspasia earlier as a foreign element that the royal system tried to attack like a virus. Did the system succeed? In the short term, yes. They ostracized her. But in the long term, the system failed catastrophically. By rejecting Aspasia, the Greek monarchy revealed its fatal weakness: rigid inflexibility. They showed the Greek people that they cared more about German bloodlines than Greek happiness. When they refused to let a Greek woman be queen, they alienated their own subjects. They reinforced the idea that they were foreign colonizers, not national leaders. Aspasia was a missed opportunity. If the royal family had embraced her in 1919, if they had said, "Look, our king has married a daughter of Athens," they could have indigenized the monarchy. They could have become truly Greek. Aspasia could have been their greatest PR asset. Instead, they turned her into a martyr. They chose purity over survival, and as a result, they eventually lost the throne forever. Aspasia, therefore, is not just a tragic figure. She is the mirror that exposed the ugliness of the dynasty. But let's be honest about Aspasia herself. Was she a hero? A hero implies a triumph. Aspasia's life was a triumph of will, but a failure of happiness. Her ambition, the drive to legitimize herself and her daughter, came at a terrible cost. She achieved the titles: Princess Alexander, Queen Alexandra. But these titles were cursed. She married her daughter to a king, Peter II, to prove a point to the ghosts of her in-laws. In doing so, she sacrificed her daughter's mental health. Aspasia is a complex character because she is both the victim of the royal system and an enforcer of it. She was abused by the hierarchy, yet she spent her life trying to climb that same hierarchy. She didn't try to destroy the monarchy, she tried to join it. This is the drama-filled contradiction of the outsider. The outsider doesn't want to burn the castle. They want a key to the front door, and they will hurt themselves trying to pick the lock. Aspasia Manos teaches us a profound philosophical lesson about the Plan B life. Her Plan A was simple: marry Alex, be queen, live happily. That plan died on October the 25th, 1920. Most people would have collapsed. Most people would have taken a payoff, changed their name, and moved to Switzerland to live anonymously. Aspasia didn't. She lived the Plan B with a ferocity that is terrifying. She accepted the half-titles. She accepted the exile. She accepted the loneliness. She turned endurance into an art form. She proves that dignity is not something you are given by a king. It is something you forge in the fire of rejection. When Queen Sophia snubbed her, Aspasia didn't scream. She stood taller. She defeated her enemies by refusing to be humiliated. In the court of public opinion, the commoner behaved with more nobility than the royals. So, what is her legacy today? In Greece, she is largely a footnote. The monarchy is a sensitive subject. But among historians and royal watchers, she is a cult figure. She is the what if. What if Alexander hadn't died? What if Aspasia had become queen? Historians agree that the Alexander-Aspasia era was the best chance Greece had for a stable modern constitutional monarchy. Their love story wasn't just a romance, it was a political alternative that was killed by a monkey and a mother-in-law. Her biological legacy lives on. Her grandson, Crown Prince Alexander of Serbia, is alive today. He is a respected figure, a democrat, a man who has returned to his country not to rule, but to serve. He carries the DNA of the Manos family. Through him, Aspasia finally won. Her bloodline is still relevant, while the pure-blooded lines of her enemies have largely faded into obscurity. The story of Aspasia Manos is a warning. It warns us against the rigidity of tradition. It warns us that when institutions place rules above humanity, they sign their own death warrants. But mostly it is a testament to the power of the individual. Aspasia Manos was one woman against an empire. She had no army, she had no money, she had no law on her side. All she had was the memory of a secret wedding in a dark room and the conviction that she was right. She walked through the fire of the 20th century, wars, exiles, deaths, madness, and she emerged on the other side, seated in her garden in Venice, unbroken. She was the queen of the shadows. And in the end, the shadows are the only thing that lasts. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the relentless, heartbreaking, and furious life of Aspasia Manos, the woman who married a king, buried a king, and fought a kingdom. It forces us to ask, would you have done it? If you were Aspasia standing in that room in 1919, knowing that saying "I do" would lead to 50 years of misery, would you still take the ring? Was the love of Alexander worth the hate of the world? There is a line from a Greek tragedy: knowledge comes through suffering. Aspasia Manos knew more than anyone. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden corners of royal history, please leave a like. It helps the algorithm find more history lovers like you. And tell me in the comments, who was the true villain of this story? The monkey, the mother-in-law, or the ambition? This is your channel name. Thank you for watching the story of the royal outcast. I'll see you in the next tragedy.